Good afternoon and a warm welcome to all of you. Today is a very special day, 67 minutes that we're going to spend together celebrating the lives of two legendary leaders, Dadi Janki and Nelson Mandela. And I was just reflecting how fortunate we are that it's in our lifetime that we've had the experience of their leadership, their love, their sustenance. So it's with a lot of love and a lot of appreciation that we remember them today. And especially in these extraordinary times that we are living, we do feel and yearn for their quality of leadership. Because in uncertain times, when you have strong value-based, spiritually empowered leadership, it offers a great deal of hope and a sense of direction. So this afternoon, just firstly to acknowledge that we started off with the praise song that was by Fatima Dike from Cape Town, who's a playwright, author, a woman in her own right that has made amazing strides, especially in the world of arts. So thank you, Fatima, for those beautiful words to start off this afternoon with the praise song. Today we're going to be sort of this conversation with Sister Jayanti and Ryland Fisher is going to be moderated by a dear friend, Eve Thompson. Eve is the founder, director of Vocal, a project that promotes African women leadership. Eve has a long history of promoting the advancement of marginalized people in Africa and beyond. She has also worked to promote value-centered leadership in the world, especially in her role as director of the United Nations University's International Leadership Academy in Amman, Jordan. She first came to South Africa from the US in '92 as an anti-apartheid lawyer. She is a long-time meditator and follower of the BK's teachings and meditation practices. So welcome, Eve, and thank you for wholeheartedly agreeing to be this afternoon's moderator and facilitating this very special conversation today. So thank you. Welcome.
Great. Thank you so much, Prativa. It's really an honor to have been asked to moderate this discussion, and I really am excited with the prospects that it holds, and I'm sure everyone will be inspired by what we hear. So happy birthday to Nelson Mandela, and welcome to all of you from South Africa and from around the world who have joined us to honor and reflect on the lives of these two giants of our world, Dadi Janki and Nelson Mandela, affectionately known to all of us as Madiba. And they have left us, but their legacies will last forever. And their presence in the world has been deeply inspiring to all of us who strive towards our own self-improvement, as well as the peaceful and mutually nurturing coexistence of all of mankind. So this webinar is an initiative of the South Africa Center of the Brahma Kumaris, which is a worldwide movement dedicated to personal transformation and world renewal. The BKs as a movement was founded in India in 1937, and since then has spread to over 110 countries on all continents. The BKs help individuals to transform their perspectives of the world, supporting the cultivation of a deep collective consciousness of peace and of individual dignity of each soul. So for those of you who are not so familiar with the BKs, I would commend you to read Peace and Purity by Liz Hodgkinson, which is a book that I've read at least twice. And I, for one, have been very deeply impacted by this organization, but as well by the two icons that we come together to celebrate today. So as Pratibha mentioned, here to lead the conversation in these reflections are two people who I believe are well known to most of you in the audience, and we're very grateful that they've agreed to take the time to share their reflections on this, which is Madiba's 102nd birthday. We know that Dadi Janki who left us also at 104 just earlier this year, she would have loved to have taken part in this celebration because she loved birthday parties. And she loved to dance, as did Madiba. They both loved to dance, and that is certainly something that they shared in common. So let me start by introducing our first featured speaker. She is Sr Jayanti, the European director of the Brahma Kumaris World Spiritual University, she is a meditation and spiritual teacher who is the author of many books and recordings on spirituality and personal transformation. Since joining the BKs over 50 years ago, she has been a powerful force for good throughout the world. And based on my own personal experience, a force infused with grace, humility, and tremendous wisdom. But we especially welcome her presence at this gathering because of the very special and enduring relationship that she shared with Dadi Janki. Just as I was looking at the slideshow earlier, I was once again moved by the reflections in those photographs of the bond that these two women shared. And I was once again moved by that. So, Sr Jayanti, we look forward to the insights that you will bring to this conversation. And so welcome, and it's wonderful to see you again.
Thank you, Eve.
Okay. And so the second person we have, I met a few years back at a BK gathering at BK headquarters in Mount Abu. But he hails from right here in South Africa. Ryland Fisher has more than 35 years of experience in the media industry as an editor, journalist, columnist, author, senior manager, and executive. And he is formerly the editor of the Cape Times and the New Age, and was assistant editor of the Sunday Times. He writes a weekly column called Thinking Aloud in the Weekend Argus, and he is also the author of a book called Race, which was published in 2007, a book that deals with race and racism in the post-apartheid South Africa. That obviously is a topic that is very important of late in the world. So as a journalist, Ryland, he has been a long-time observer of the evolution of leadership in this country and how leaders from across the spectrum have navigated the transition from apartheid to democracy. So once again, welcome Ryland, and we are very honored to have you with us.
Thank you so much.
Great. So as we get started with this conversation, I am an American, and I'm very mindful of the fact that just yesterday, we lost John Lewis, who was an icon and a giant of the civil rights movement. And so that led me to think about this topic and the fact that the civil rights movement during that period in the US, there was a phrase that everyone talked about, and I think it was picked up from a song called "Keep Your Eyes on the Prize." And when I think about that phrase, it sort of aptly characterizes how both Madiba and Dadi Janki really went about pursuing the goals in their life that they set out to achieve. And so I would like to get some insights, starting with Sr Jayanti, about what were sort of the principles that helped anchor them and helped keep them, or help them to have that laser focus on the goals that they pursued. So if you could share a few reflections about that, starting with Sr Jayanti.
Thank you very much, Eve, and hello to Ryland, who I met some years ago, many times through the years. And I'm happy to be with both of you and the gathering today. And maybe one thing that was shared by Fatima in the commentary had been about Dadi's love for God and her faith in God. And so that was maybe the power with which she moved forward in life. And on a more human level, I'd say that it was her commitment to honesty, and she would use three words together very often. And in Hindi, those three words rhyme, but I won't bother you with the Hindi. For the translation, honesty, cleanliness inside and out, and thirdly, simplicity. And so honesty, Dadi, absolutely very clear, absolutely straight, but with kindness and compassion. And when she spoke, you knew that what she was saying was the truth, but it was for my benefit. It wasn't to prove anything or to have power over another, but the truth, honesty. Simplicity, she was absolutely simple, and you know that. She wore a simple white gown and very, very few possessions, literally just a handful of things that were absolutely needed. She did not want anything extra in her room, in her life, whatever, just basic, and cleanliness. And she felt that the cleanliness of heart and motive and intention was maybe the powerful way in which we could achieve so much. If there were other things mixed in with intention and motive, anything selfish for the self, then she would say, you're not going to get there. But if you clean out your heart and your intentions, then you'll have help from above and you'll get there. And this is what we observed, her walking, her talk with these three qualities in particular.
Great, thank you so much. Ryland, you know, obviously Madiba was more of a political figure than a spiritual one, but he really shared so much of those qualities with Dadi Janki. So if you can share a few of your reflections about that.
Yeah, thank you, Eve. Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this program. So Nelson Mandela, you know, like so many people who became involved in the struggle to oppose apartheid and colonialism, was an accidental politician. Not that he didn't love politics, but his involvement in politics came about because of his opposition to a cruel and inhumane system, and not because it was something that he had set his mind on when he was young. His opposition to apartheid and colonialism was based on his love for his people and his realization that apartheid and colonialism were premised on one group of people discriminating against other groups. Nelson Mandela's love for people is what drove him, and that is why he was in many ways almost the perfect servant leader. This notion of servant leadership comes through in many parts of his life. From his speech at the Rivonia trial in 1964, in which he declared himself prepared to die for his beliefs, which led him to serving his people in the first place, to his famous speech on the Grand Parade in 1990, on the day of his release, when he once again declared himself a humble servant of the people, to his many unsuccessful attempts to retire. When he came out of prison, Mandela would have been forgiven for saying that at the age of 72, he had decided that he wanted to spend some time with his family, you know, and get to know his children and his grandchildren, but he didn't. He realized that it was necessary for him to become the first democratically elected president of the Republic of South Africa in order to see through the transition from apartheid to democracy. He served for one term, which he said he would do at the outset, and then he stepped down. But he didn't step down from public life. He continued to serve, whether it was through the Nelson Mandela Foundation or through many of the legacy projects started in his name and his honor. So the love for people, all people, but particularly the oppressed, which resulted in a lifetime of service, would be, in my humble opinion, the main principle that informed his life. Everything else, including his commitment to reconciliation, would derive from this. And I think maybe I'll leave it and then we can talk a little bit more later. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you both. You know, I think one of the reasons that many of the people who have joined us now have joined us because they're looking for some sort of inspiration, because we are facing right at this moment in the world an unprecedented crisis. And that has been joined by so many other crises that we've been facing in the last several weeks and months. And so I would like to ask each of you, starting perhaps now with you, Ryland, to reflect a little bit about how Madiba negotiated his way through different crises. And there's some certainly things that stand out in my mind about certain crises that erupted in the course of his leadership, both before the end of apartheid and afterwards. So just share with us a little bit about how he used all of the qualities that you mentioned earlier to address crisis situations.
Thank you. So one of the things that I learned from Madiba is that it is important to always stick to your values and to let us guide you in every decision you make in life. Mandela put values and principles above personal and political party loyalties. He believed in judging everyone and everything in terms of these values and principles. His commitment to his values, including non-racism and non-sexism, allowed him to deal with the various crises that he faced in his life. He always believed that what he stood for was right and would eventually come to fruition. This belief is what made him comfortable with dedicating his life to struggle, with being prepared to die for his belief, and with spending 27 years in prison. Your values, which are nurtured over time, should be able to see you through every crisis, he believed. In a conversation with Richard Stengel in 1993, Madiba said, and I quote, "If you want to take an action and you are convinced that it is the correct action, you do so and confront that situation." Madiba believed in consulting as widely as possible, but he also believed that leaders, once elected, needed to be able to lead and take decisions which can sometimes be unpopular. So I remember in the early 1990s, there was lots of tension between different warring groups of people in Durban. And Madiba went to them and basically told them to put their spears away and to dump them into the sea. And of course, it wasn't well received by the crowd, but he said to them, if I'm your leader, you have to listen to me. And if you don't want to listen to me, then drop me as your leader. So he was brave. He took that kind of decision to tell them, I mean, if you don't want me, you can drop me as your leader. And they, of course, listened. So his leadership style was a combination of consultation, decisiveness, bearing in mind that one can only consult to a certain extent and then one has to show leadership. And so in a crisis like the one we're facing at the moment, one sometimes gets a sense that that is missing from those who govern us, that they're not prepared to be that decisive. And it's like a case of, nobody's prepared to say that the buck stops with me in this decision that I've taken. Mandela was also mindful or willing to admit when he had made a mistake. He was mindful of his love for people at all times, and especially those who were most vulnerable in society, who he believed placed him in a leadership position. So when I see how today the leadership in South Africa, but probably throughout the world, how they play to business interests and to the rich people in society. And I think about what Madiba said, he said, if you don't take precautions, it is easy to forget that you've been put into your position by the poorest of the poor. And so I think that's some of the lessons that one could learn from him today still. Thank you.
So just Ryland, as a follow-up, before we move to Sister Jayanti, I just want to bring up, because one of the crises that stand in my mind in terms of Mandela's history is the crisis that came about as the result of the assassination of Chris Hani. And yeah. I recall when that happened, I was actually just about to host a dinner party in my home in the US a dinner party involving South Africans, and they got the word that Chris had been shot and killed. And the conversation immediately turned to, oh my goodness, this is going to be a bloodbath. Suddenly there's going to be a civil war in this country. And the reason I bring this up is because Nelson Mandela's response was so natural. It was instinctive. He immediately diffused the situation at a very pivotal moment in the country where it could have really gone either way. And so I guess my question, and perhaps to both of you, is can we cultivate that kind of instinctual approach or ability to handle a crisis situation? Because for many of us, a crisis can actually paralyze us. And so what do we need to do? And perhaps this can be for Sister Jayanti as well in terms of invoking Dadi Janki, but just you can comment on that.
Okay, so maybe let the, the situation around Chris Hani was quite important. You must remember that at that point, Mandela was not the president of the country. He was just the president of the ANC. But even before, so Nelson Mandela never really believed in leadership positions. He believed in serving. So even when the decision, for instance, that was taken to focus on him when he was in prison and not on the other prisoners so much, was a decision that was taken by the collective, and he kind of went along. When he came out, he didn't have a position within the ANC, and but he was respected as a leader. And then, of course, the ANC then created a position for him of deputy president, just to accommodate him in the meantime, while Oliver Tambo was the president. I'm saying this because you need to understand how this man, he was a servant, and he was prepared to do whatever was required. So when Chris Hani was killed, F.W. de Klerk, who was then the president of the country, realized that whatever he said wasn't going to help the situation. And he then called on Madiba to speak to the nation. And Madiba spoke to the nation and calmed people down. And yes, you're right. I mean, Chris Hani, the people who assassinated Chris Hani, that was probably the intention to engineer a bloodbath at the time, because it wasn't in their interest for our democracy to proceed in the way it was proceeding. And so his intervention was brilliant, and it was amazing. And that day, well, when I saw Madiba making that speech, I kind of sat and I felt like crying because I realized that I was listening to a president. The first time I felt like that was when I stood on the Grand Parade and I listened to him speaking that day, the first time in 27 years that I heard him speaking, and I cried. It was because I realized that this was a president. So I think that, for me, the important thing is, how do you cultivate it? Is to be selfless leadership, to do things without expecting any, acknowledgement, any benefit, just to do it because it's the right thing to do. And that is the thing I think that drove Madiba. He did whatever he did because he just felt it was the right thing to do, irrespective of what he was going to get out of the deal.
Thank you. Sister Jayanti, just picking up from that, can we cultivate, for those of us who do sort of become paralyzed in the face of a crisis, how can we unlock that, and how can we cultivate an ability to be instinctual with regard to that? And please also feel free to share a story about Dadi Janki that can sort of symbolize that. Thank you.
I want to pick up firstly on Ryland's very beautiful description of Madiba, and that is the servant leader. Because Dadi, actually, the word Dadi means senior sister. And she would say to us when she first arrived in London, this was in 1974, and she was 59 years of age, and it was her first time to travel abroad. And she came to London with me, and we settled in a little place, which was the center at that time. And she said, "Don't call me Dadi. I'm not your Dadi. I'm your sister. I'm your friend." And so, in a way, that describes that idea of not taking on that title of leader on any level. And then Dadi was 92 when she was asked to be the head of the organization, when the sister who had been leading the organization passed away in the year 2007. So 92 years of age, you don't normally take on a new job. But Dadi had the courage and again that spirit of service of people, and she knew that this is what was needed at that time. And in terms of cultivating that right instinct, again, Ryland has mentioned something very, very apt, and that is the selflessness. If I have a selfish motive on any level, then I'm not going to know what is the right thing to do. But the state of being selfless and clean, is how Dadi would describe it, means that she always had this connection with the divine. You would ask her a question and she would go into silence for a moment. And you could see she was connecting with a higher power. And then she would respond. And so Dadi's instinct came from her relationship with the divine. And we would know that whatever guidance we were being given was not because she was the chief or the leader, but it's because that was the right thing to be done at that moment. And so, yes, totally agree in so many different ways. And a particular situation that describes Dadi, right at the very beginning, when she wanted to become a surrendered yogi to come and stay in the ashram that Brahma Baba had founded in 1937, because her calling was to surrender her life to God and the service of humanity. She was actually being beaten at home, but Dadi's faith never wavered. It's an indication of the state of affairs in terms of inequality in gender that existed in the subcontinent at that time, or even I would say in some situations in households today, also across the world. But because of her gender, she was not given any option, she was not given any choices, and yet she managed to settle what we would say was that karmic situation, and her faith and her love allowed her to move out of that and surrender to God. And then just imagine this 59-year-old woman who's never been outside of India coming to London, and there were practically just a handful of students in London at that time, people who were studying Raj Yoga at that point in 1974. And she left behind a very well-established center, her role in the headquarters in Mount Abu. And there was a motivation in her mind and in her heart that she wanted to serve people. And she saw that there was a lot of service happening in India already, but people abroad needed to know about peace and purity and love and truth. And so something within her made her say yes when she was asked to come abroad. She didn't know the language, she was coming to a foreign country, and at that moment, everything in the life of the Brahmakumaris was very basic, very simple. So 2 little rooms in an area of London that's not so brilliant. And she was ready to sacrifice all of that to come into a very simple setting and like start from scratch. But her love for people and her love to bring souls closer to God allowed her to do that. And so many different situations where it wasn't as dramatic as Madiba, of course, because she wasn't a political leader in that way, but holding the flag for women. And at that moment in 1937, and continuing with that till the end of her lifetime, she trained not just women, but men and women here who became leaders and teachers in so many different countries across the globe. In fact, I would say most of our dedicated teachers across the world have had training from Dadi in some form or another, whether in London or in Mount Abu or in their own continents. And so that vision of justice and truth and equality was very powerful and motivated her in so many different ways. And of course, she rejected any form of violence, so that when somebody would say to her, but you know, Dadi, they're not treating you with respect as they should, they're getting angry about this, that, and the other. And she was very much interested in the power of purity. And that's not a fashionable thing at this moment, but her love for truth and her love and commitment to God was such that she would stand up for the rights of the oppressed, especially women, but also for others who were facing injustice. And so she would make sure that she would try and help them and support them on that personal level of empowerment. I'll give you one little story. She went to Brazil, and in Brazil, this was the first time she went was in 1981. And after that, she went many more times, of course. But when she saw how simple the lives of people there were a few who came from affluent backgrounds, but many very simple. And they said to her, Dadi, we'd love to go to Mount Abu, but we don't think we can ever get there. And she would talk to them about self-empowerment. She would talk to them about taking power from above and filling the self with a state of contentment and abundance, and how if they feel that there's something lacking, it will stay that way. But if they can change their inner consciousness and feel that there is abundance and they're able to share love and joy with others, then physical abundance will also come. And so from that point, when just about 2 or 3 people had come all the way on pilgrimage to Mount Abu, soon after that, after her visit, we found groups of 30, 60, 100 coming to Mount Abu. So her focus was on empowerment of the individual, so that they would make that connection with the divine, and through that connection overcome whatever were the hurdles that they were facing in their life. Her story of overcoming many, many illnesses is legendary. Age 104, and starting her journey when she surrendered for service. She'd already gone through pneumonia and TB and all sorts of things. And I nearly saw her leave. I've known her for 60 plus years, since I was a child. And at least 8 times I must have heard or seen in later times that she's at the point of departure. But her commitment to service and her love for God, there's still something more I have to do, would give her renewed energy. And she would again begin to serve after some weeks or a month or so. We would see her come rebound back with renewed vigor on the field of service. And so the capacity of that soul to tolerate difficulties, whether it was the situation of total simplicity where very few facilities were available, or whether it was challenges with the body or dealing with angry people, I just saw her absolutely sail through all of these things with benevolence, concerned that the other soul should experience something from God, peace and love, and through that create a change, a transformation.
Thank you very much. That is beautiful. And I really wanted to pick up on something that you said early on in your response to this question, which is you talked about, and I don't know how many people are aware of the kind of pain and hardship that Dadi Janki went through very early on in her life, and to the point where she ended up having to escape a situation, and which is what led her to the Brahma Kumaris. And so both Dadi Janki and Madiba went through a lot of pain and hardship. But as I think Ryland said, or perhaps you said, no bitterness. And this is at a time when there's the pandemic, but there's also the crisis that emerged out of the situation that happened in the US a few months ago with the murder of George Floyd, and that sparked a worldwide movement around victimhood, victimization, and so it'd be interesting to hear from you about, because there are a lot of people who are feeling a lot of the pain. That incident seemed to tap the sense of victimhood in a lot of people around the world. And so I'd like to hear about how both Dadi Janki and Nelson Mandela, how they managed to rise above their victimization, because both of them did suffer victimization at the hands of people who were more powerful. And so that, I think, is a question for a lot of people these days, that how do you rise above it? And another question would be, what is the role that forgiveness plays in all of that? So starting with Sister Jayanti.
Dadi's vision of a world of truth and justice was absolutely what she saw, and as was described earlier, her focus was always that. And she knew that the path you tread is going to be the destination that you arrive at. Just unpacking that a little. If today I say I want to have a world of peace, I cannot use violence. If I'm using violence, then the destination is going to be more violence. If I today, in the midst of violence, follow the path of peace, then the destination is going to be peace also. And so if today I follow the path of truth and justice within my own inner world and the way in which I speak and behave and think, of course, that's what's going to lead us to that world. And if I don't adhere to those principles that I believe in, then I'm not going to be able to help others move in that direction also. And of course, there's the question, well, okay, I change, what about everybody else? But we can't underestimate the power of one individual. Madiba, Dadi Janki, the impact that they've had on millions. Dadi in a very subtle, incognito way and becoming more and more visible now. And Madiba, of course, in a very visible way. And I think that the other bloodbath that was averted was just pre the elections in 1994, because there was disaster being predicted. And yet Madiba and forgiveness, and there was no bloodbath. There was a very relatively smooth transition to the democratic elections. So I think that for Dadi also, I'll tell you something she talked about when she spoke of forgiveness. She said that forgiveness is poison in my heart. And even if I've forgiven 3, but there's one I haven't forgiven, then that poison still remains, and that bitterness is going to come through in whatever else it is I'm thinking and speaking and doing. So it has to be unreserved. Forgiveness is freedom. If I don't forgive, I'm holding myself back in chains and in bondage. And of course, President Mandela, being released from prison, talked about the same thing. If I carry bitterness, I'm still keeping myself in prison. And so forgiveness is the way forward. And so Dadi Janki also would say that I have to release whatever bitterness I have, take the power of God's love so that I can change whatever is going on inside and find that freedom within. Then I can show others the path to truth and justice, not through violence, And so I think this for me would be the message for this period of time. Of course, it also means that that being, that soul itself, has to be above the limits of race and culture and gender. Come to that state where they can have such unconditional love that they're able to forgive.
Great, thank you. Ryland, if you add.
Yeah, no.
Right.
I'd like to add, I mean, I must just say that I would really love to be at that point where Dadi Janki was and where Sr Jayanti is also. I feel that, you know, forgiveness is an important part of dealing with many of the issues that we face today. But forgiveness should never be seen in isolation. It needs to go with an acceptance by perpetrators that they have wronged. This then needs to be followed by discussion and education before forgiveness can be effective. You can't just have a situation where the person says sorry and then everything seems to be fine. So, for instance, before we can talk about forgiveness with regards to the Black Lives Matter movement, there needs to be an acknowledgement among white people about why this campaign is so important. And this is something that I don't see in South Africa, which is a pity because of the way blacks in South Africa, in the interest of reconciliation, were prepared to forgive whites for decades of pain caused under apartheid and even longer under colonialism. In the same way, the victims of violence perpetrated by men against women cannot expect the perpetrators of violence, or not the victims, cannot expect forgiveness without any contrition or concomitant punishment. If I have one criticism of Madiba, it is that he embraced forgiveness too easily without seemingly having real expectations from the perpetrators of the offenses he forgave. So, in fact, when he was interviewed, I think I mentioned this interview or this conversation with Richard Stengel, where he also said, you know, I'm working now with the same people who threw me into jail, persecuted my wife, hounded my children from one school to the other. And I'm one of those who are saying, let us forget the past and think of the present. That's very difficult to forget the past and to focus on the present when in South Africa, at least, the past stares you in the face every day. The past can be seen in the unresourced dormitory townships, which millions of South Africans call home, and the millions of unemployed youth who have no hope of ever finding work in an economy that is meant to benefit the few at the expense of the many. So Madiba's focus on forgiveness was important to help South Africa transition from years of apartheid to become a democracy. He realized that at the time, most of the skills and the economic power in South Africa were in white hands, and he wanted to retain that. With hindsight, there are some political commentators who say that Mandela was wrong in his assessment of the situation and could have done more. But Mandela and his political organization, the ANC, didn't have hindsight, and they had to take decisions based on what they thought was right. But I also sense that Madiba realized at some points that the forgiveness project wasn't quite going the way he wanted it to go. And he tried to solicit responses from those who had transgressed. So, you know, he started the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And part of what the TRC was supposed to do was to kind of get to the truth, reconcile people, you know, perpetrators and victims. But the big criticism of the TRC was that it never took the next step, and which was to provide justice for the victims. So, yeah, so I suppose while I understand Madiba's situation or his position on forgiveness, I think that in a country like South Africa, there needed to be a step that went beyond just kind of saying you are forgiven. There needed to be something that we got in return for forgiving people who perpetrated violence against us.
Yeah. If I could just sort of pick up, because you said a lot, and I think you touched on one of the huge challenges that this whole debate really captures, which is how do you reach inside yourself as someone who has not just been a victim once, but is constantly being victimized by an overall system of whether it's racism or marginalization, or whether it's the Rohingya people in Myanmar. I mean, so it's very, very difficult. I mean, there are victims who have been absolutely brutalized. And so you very rightly point out, how can you bring yourself to forgive, and certainly how can you forget what's been done to you? But one of the things about Madiba is that he really rejected actively taking on the cloak of victimhood, because I think he saw that it did not serve. Victim pathology was really very, it led to paralysis, if not worse. And so one of the things that it seemed that he was very, very good at, even before he was released from prison, was to show the victimizer how to be human, which was his strategy for dealing with the victimization that he suffered. And one of the moments, again, that I think epitomizes that for me is when he was determined to have tea with Betsy Verfoot, the widow of the architect of apartheid. And she turned him down initially. She didn't want him to come to Orania, the white enclave that that had been established in the post-apartheid period for white people who did not want to be part of post-apartheid South Africa. So he went, despite her initial reluctance. And once again, I think someone during the poetry reading, I think they said he was able to disarm people with his charm, but also to show them how to be human. And so what is your sort of take on that in terms of a solution to this dilemma? How do victims get out of that, the debilitating aspects of victimhood?
It's with great difficulty, I think. And I think if you look at someone like Madiba, Madiba realized that he had strength, inner strength, and that he also had kind of political strength. And so he was able to use that in whatever kind of interactions he had with people who might have wronged him in the past. And so the unfortunate thing is that the majority of people do not have that, you know. The majority of people who are victims of racism and victims of sexism and victims of violence committed by men against women don't have that kind of sense of power. And so it's been very difficult for them to use that. And so Madiba, and I mean, I love Madiba and I appreciate what he did, but I also, he realized that he was in a situation where his political power, his personal power offered him some kind of protection. And so he wasn't able to use that against the people who, you know, who might have wronged him in the past. And like I said, unfortunately, the majority of people don't have it. And I don't know how. I personally, as somebody who doesn't come anywhere close to Madiba, I have this situation where I will walk into a room, and if the room is filled with white racist people, I will speak to them. And if I'm able to convince one of them to change his mind, then, you know, I'm happy. But I'm foolish enough to be able to do that kind of thing. I think most people, if you spot a room filled with a whole lot of white racist people, you just turn around and you walk away. So yeah, it requires a lot of personal courage to be able to do what Madiba did. And I don't know whether the majority of people actually have that kind of personal courage.
So, Sister Jayanti, thanks, Ryland. What would you say to that, to Ryland's last point? What would you say to the people who do feel that they just can't summon up that personal courage to be able to rise above having been a victim of gender-based violence or of racism and brutalization? What would you say to those people? And what would Dadi Janki say to those people?
I want to put into a bigger context this question, and that is the whole subject of spirituality and its role in the world. We've tried politics, we've tried protest, we've tried economy, we've tried revolutions, we've tried all sorts of things, but we haven't actually got the world that we would like to have as yet. And so the spiritual answer is that there has to be a solution that we find within ourselves that gives us the power and the courage to be able to change things. And Ryland, I want to say to you that no, it wasn't foolishness that makes you want to change even one racist person. And I'm sure you could do it, not just for one, but many, many. I think it was your inner courage that allowed you to step into situations like that and continue. So I think that the spiritual answer, and of course, this is what Dadi would say, is that you have to have that inner connection with the divine, and you have to go beyond all the limits of the externals of your own identity, because all these externals of race and gender and age are the box, but the being inside is something else. And so she would remind people that they're not this, but they're that inner being, that living energy that's able to make a choice for the future. One particular statement I want to share, and I know it has been misinterpreted in the past, and I take that risk at this moment. She would say that if someone's a victim, what is it that they want from the oppressor that they keep themselves in that situation of being a victim? You can see how it's open to misinterpretation, but it's also pointing out a very deep spiritual concept. Why do I allow someone to put me in bondage? I don't need to do that. And of course, her own life was testimony to that. And she found the courage and had the inner spiritual capacity to move out of that situation and reverse the whole story completely. But today, again, if I can take spiritual power from the divine, and I believe every human being has a right to that, and I believe that actually many of the Black community, the brown community, the colored community, and different ethnic minorities, perhaps they have a deeper love for God than most. And so if they were to turn to that love and find that power that comes from that inner love for God, then they would be able to step out of their situation and no more be the victim. I know that there are many, many political factors and factors of inequality around us, but I've seen this happen, where a person has courage and faith in God and love for God, they're able to break through all the bondages and come out the other side. And so it's an important question to ask myself, what is it that's keeping me in bondage? Do I need to be in that situation?
Yeah, and you find that I find it a lot when I'm dealing with women who are being abused, and my advice always to them is just get out of that relationship. And 90% of the time, they actually don't get out of the relationship, and they kind of remain in there, and they continue to be abused. And it's always said, and sometimes the women who are suffering this abuse are professional women, they are educated women, they understand at an intellectual level why they need to get out, but at another level, they are not able to kind of to make that move. And so, yeah, it's difficult. And so I would like to get to that level of spirituality where, where making that kind of move becomes a natural thing for me. And I think a lot of the women who are in abusive relationships, for instance, would also like to get to that point of spirituality, but they're not there. And so there's still some work to be done to be able to get them to that kind of level.
I agree also with your point about education. It's education on both sides. You're absolutely right that forgiveness on its own, without that process of understanding what has gone wrong and my part in what has gone wrong, and then the education and the transformation is absolutely part of that whole subject of reformation. Yeah.
I want to move us to a lighter or less heavy subject as we start to wind down this meeting. And that is just, again, if we look at some of the traits that both Dadi Janki and Madiba had in common, one is the ability to kind of see the big picture at the same time as kind of attending to small details. And I think with Madiba, the instance that comes to mind around that for him was the 1995 Rugby World Cup, when, and this is captured by the film Invictus, where he was so focused on every aspect of that tournament. And he felt that that South Africa needed to win that World Cup in order to promote unity and social cohesion in the country. And that's why he met with Francois Pienaar on a regular basis. So just I'd like to hear from both of you, perhaps starting with Ryland, about their ability to do that.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm not going to talk about the Rugby World Cup because I think that story has really been shared a lot. I had the honor and the privilege to be editor of the Cape Times, which is probably one of South Africa's most influential daily newspapers at the time when Madiba was president. As such, I had many interactions with him. Some of the interactions were more intimate than others, including one-on-one engagements. He had a great memory and remembered many things that many others would simply forget. I have so many stories about how I remembered our previous interactions and would remind me of things we had spoken about. He had a habit of calling morning newspaper editors early in the morning when we were still waking up after late night to discuss what he believed to be misrepresentations in some of our reports. It was never done in a threatening manner, and in most cases he was correct, and we would clarify our actions afterwards. But the story I wanted to share about how Madiba remembered details related to an occasion that I observed in the mid-1990s. I don't know whether it was president already or whether it was before he became president. You can see how bad my memory is. So Madiba was invited to speak at a huge workers' conference in Johannesburg. When he entered the hall through the front entrance and he was busy making his way to the stage, his eyes scoured the thousands of people who were loudly cheering him, shouting his name in adulation and singing freedom songs in his honor. Suddenly he stopped and he started walking down the middle aisle of this big conference center towards the back of the hall, much to the consternation of his security detail and the event organizers who wanted to put him onto the stage immediately so he could, address the people. He stopped probably about 10 rows into the audience and approached an old man and began talking to him. Mandela spent a good few minutes talking to the old man, whose eyes welled up with tears. It turned out that the man was a former neighbor of Madiba's in Soweto, and Madiba had asked him about what had happened to some of their former neighbors. Mandela had not seen this man for more than 30 years, but remembered his face, even though it was now much older, and his name. I was a few meters away from all of us and recalled the tears of joy on the old man's face so vividly. This was one of the ways in which his memory was so special.
Great. Thank you. And Sister Jayanti, what can you share about Dadi Janki in terms of her ability? I mean, she led a very large organization at an advanced age, as you mentioned, and but she still had time for everyone, even as the organization got larger and larger. Can you share some special moments with regard to that?
Again, many different stories and memories, but one particular incident, and it may be relevant and bring inspiration to some. Dadi was visiting London, and there was a young woman who had spoken to me and another one of our sisters, and she'd had a story of abuse, and she couldn't get it out of her mind. She was meditating, coming here regularly to our center, but she was getting stuck with this. I tried different ways. The other sister had also tried. And then when Dadi was visiting London, by then she was already settled in India, so she wasn't resident here anymore. And I made sure that this young woman could spend just a few minutes with Dadi, introduced her and told Dadi that story briefly. And Dadi's response to her was, as you would imagine, deeply spiritual. First of all, Dadi just gave her drishti, sharing with her that love for God through her eyes. We practice open eyes meditation, so Dadi was adept at that. So she gave her that drishti, that vision of love and God's compassion and power combined together. And then she said to her, but surely you've had a spiritual rebirth. Now the memory of that past birth can finish, and you can just enjoy your new spiritual rebirth. This concept of rebirth, which is a spiritual awakening, is very strong in Christianity too, of course. But it's a spiritual concept, so not just exclusive to one religion, but everywhere. And I never had to speak to that girl again about her sorrow, because Dadi spoke from the heart and with the power of love and yoga. And so what she said touched the heart of the other, and that soul's sorrow was removed, and she never had to come back with that same question, what shall I do? What can I do? So on a personal, individual level, she was able to change that woman's consciousness to a higher plane and remind her of her new spiritual rebirth, and it changed her life.
Yes, I myself remember when I first met Dadi and had the opportunity to sit face to face with her in a private room. And whenever you meet someone who you know has met a million people around the world, you kind of expect them not to really have much time for you. And she was, however, completely different. She was the kind of person who made everybody feel special, like they were the only person in her life. And it takes a special gift to do that. So I'd like to, I'm not sure, but they never got to meet each other. Is that right, Sister Jayanti?
No. Dadi did meet President Mandela. And she did.
Okay.
It was in Cape Town. And a man called J. Naidu, who was at that time Minister for Telecommunications, was a good friend of the Brahma Kumaris, and he organized that meeting. And it was a very, very sweet meeting. And I think there was a connection which was not a president and a citizen, but it was of two giants, as you say, two souls who have incredible power and kindness. The contrast of power and kindness is immense, but they managed, both of them, to combine both of these qualities together. So it was a very sweet meeting, and I was translating for Dadi, so I was in that meeting. Yeah.
How long was the meeting? Did it last? Right.
Probably about 20, 25 minutes, no more than that. But it was one, certainly Dadi remembered it for a long time afterwards. And I hope that Mandela also remembered this little Indian lady in a very simple white sari who came to see him.
And had you had any further interactions with Madiba, or was that your one interaction?
In fact, there was an interaction prior to that.
Okay.
Soon after he became president, there was a gathering in Durban, which was in a big, big stadium. And the invitation to the person who was the head of the organization at that time, Dadi Prakash Mani, was to come and speak about the message of the scripture of India, the Gita. And so they both met together on stage, and then a little meeting afterwards off the stage. But Dadiji was there, and again, I happened to be there as her translator. So I had the good fortune of meeting him twice. At that point in the gathering, the stadium, it was the spiritual significance of scriptures. And so again, you can see that side of Madiba, in which, although he was political, he was also deeply spiritual, and he would give time after being president to such gatherings. So those were the two occasions, and not after that.
Okay, great. And Ryland, what are your reflections about Dadi Janki? I know you traveled to Mount Abu at least once or more than that to participate in all of the time. Just can you share your experiences with Dadi Janki?
Yeah, no, thank you. So I've been privileged to be in the presence of Dadi a couple of times, including attending 100 birthday celebrations in India a few years ago. But the first time I met her, also in India, which was a couple of years before that, was also when I had an opportunity to spend a few minutes alone with her. And I remember going into this room, little room, and I can't remember much because I was so kind of starstruck and, not really kind of sure what to expect. But I remember seeing a little bed, and I think there might have been one or two chairs, but I can't remember. And she allowed me to just speak to her about some of the issues I was dealing with at the time. And then she said something that changed my life in many ways. She said that my biggest problem was that I was stressing over stuff that I had no control over. I walked away from her realizing that most things in life we have no control over. So it doesn't help to stress at all most of the time. One of the things that impressed me most was a kind of silent humility. She would sit in meetings and she would just listen. And from time to time, she would make a comment, which were mainly profound. But she also had a wicked sense of humor and would often make jokes, especially about those who were close to her. I remember one day, Dadi had addressed us in a hall, and afterwards I was walking outside and I saw her leaving through the back of this hall. And she got into a very ordinary looking Japanese sedan. I'm not going to name the brand of the car. I remember thinking that this woman is the head of this powerful international organization. And where is the luxury German sedan? Which is what we associate with people with power. But she wasn't about material positions. And I believe that this is probably one of the reasons why she was so powerful.
Ryland, can I remind you, at one time when she was visiting South Africa, she'd made a statement about busy people use the excuse of being busy because they're lazy. And you
Yeah,
asked a question about that. How can busy
yeah,
people be lazy? And
yeah,
clarify that.
yeah, yeah. No, no, no. I think, as with most people who are wise, they leave you with something, but they still leave you with work to do. So they would say something to you, but it won't be the kind of the complete solution to whatever you're looking for. You would still have to search a little bit further, and you would kind of have to unpack whatever it is that was said to you. And so that is what she did with me. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about what she said, and I kind of realized that what she said made absolute sense. And it has really, I mean, I think 50 or almost 50 at that time. And it took me so long to kind of to realize one of the most important lessons in my life. And if I had known that much earlier in my life, I would have lived a much more stress-free life than what I did.
So actually, before we get to the last question that I have for both of you, I just want to announce to the audience that you can perhaps start composing your questions when we move to the question and answer segment of this. You can start composing the questions in the chat room. So by the time we're finished with this last question, we can have a few questions to pose to our two speakers. So during the course of this discussion, we have identified the different qualities that both these two very impactful people have shown us. And there are things like humility, sacrifice, compassion, etc. And all of these things in our efforts, in all of our, for all of us mere mortals, we're all striving towards that. We're all striving to embody those kinds of qualities. But often what happens is there's something that happens in the external world and we're pulled away from that path. And so I guess my question is, how do we keep anchored on the path? And how do we get to from the point of admiring those qualities and these icons that we see and internalizing them in ourselves? So perhaps I'll start with Sister Jayanti.
What Dadi would tell people when they would ask her this question, I'm sure both of you would remember something similar. She would say, give time to yourself. And so start the day with time for introspection, for silence, spend time in something spiritually uplifting, reading, listening, something like that, so that you begin the day giving time to feeding and nourishing your own inner being. And if you can do that on a daily basis, even if it's very busy, but make that sacred, that time for yourself, then you're in touch with your own inner values and you're in touch with the divine. And so that's going to keep you on the track that is right. It's going to set the compass for the day and you're going to be able to move towards the truth. So that would be Dadi's response, I think.
Okay. And Ryland, what can you
offer? I would just like to say what she said. No, but I think, if you look at Madiba, his service, like I said earlier, was based on his values and his principles. It was never about self-gratification, wanting praise, or seeking to be seen as a perfect person. One of Madiba's kind of things that he was quite concerned about, he said, I don't want people to see me as a saint. And he joked about the saint being a sinner who keeps on trying. But he said, I mean, even within that definition, I don't think I'm a saint. he was very nervous about kind of people elevating him to, to all these kind of different positions. So, and he really just believed in doing things. And this is also, I mean, when as a young man, I became kind of involved in political struggle in the 1980s. And one of my political mentors was a guy called Johnny Issel. And he also taught me about, you should help people unconditionally, and it will eventually come back to you in unexpected ways. Give with the expectation, and you will receive different rewards when you least expect it. Sometimes the reward is just the knowledge that you've done good. So it starts with kind of testing our values, testing our principles, and seeing how much we are doing to realize what we say we believe in. And then it requires a commitment to make it happen. I suppose, yeah, my answer is probably a little bit more, not spiritual, kind of more practical, but I believe that is what people need to do. There are too many people in the world today who will only do good if other people will know that they've done good. And for me, that is wrong, and it needs to be just doing good because it's the correct thing to do.
Right. Agree.
Yeah. While we're just waiting for more questions to come in the chat room, I just want to ask one more question. Sorry, I promise this will be the one. Just about being in a leadership position and making unpopular decisions. Maybe Ryland, if you can start. Both of them, I know a bit more about Madiba in this regard, but both of them were people who led organizations or led entities. They often had to make a departure from their followers in terms of the decisions that they took. And they weren't always popular decisions. And perhaps many of their followers challenged them. Can you just talk a little bit about that in terms of the personal courage that it takes to make unpopular decisions, and how was that in Madiba's case? Yeah,
so one of the jokes that people often make in South Africa, and I don't know if it's the same in the rest of the country, but they say, if you want to remain friends with people, you never talk to them about religion, and you never talk to them about sport. So one of the examples where Madiba kind of went against the grain of the ANC collective was when the consensus among just about everybody in the ANC was that they needed to drop the Springbok emblem as the emblem of our national rugby team. And Madiba went and he argued for them to retain the Springbok emblem as the emblem of the national rugby team. And he won the argument. So it wasn't a case of he actually went and he won on the basis of argument. But there was another decision that I thought was probably a little bit more difficult for him. And it wasn't a very popular decision at the time. And this was when he decided to fire his former wife, Winnie Mandela, who he had appointed as a deputy minister. And she was immensely popular within the ANC. And in fact, even after death, she is still immensely popular within the ANC. And firing her at the time meant creating animosity towards himself within the ANC. But he took the decision despite the personal and political considerations. He was able to live with this and other decisions, knowing that they were taken in the spirit of his values and his beliefs, and not based on personal or party political preferences. So yeah, those were the two kind of examples which, for different reasons, I think probably tested him quite a bit.
Okay, thanks. And Sister Jayanti, did Dadi Janki ever take unpopular decisions, and was she ever torn in terms of, you know, wanting to still show solidarity with her followers, but at the same time she felt like she had to make a different decision?
If you think about the climate of Western Europe in the 80s, it was very definitely non-awareness of God. And if God was ever mentioned, it would become a highly debatable issue. And we were running a project which was meant to be non-religious, and it was, and that was called the Million Minutes of Peace Appeal. I don't know whether you heard about this, but it was asking people to give minutes for peace through prayer or meditation or reflection, whatever. And it became the largest non-fundraising project by an NGO for the UN in the International Year of Peace. And so we would say to Dadi that, because she was there at many of our programs, of course, she was living in London, we'd say, Dadi, just talk about peace, but please don't talk about God. And Dadi did not like that one little bit. And she thought that, you know, my existence is because of God's love. I'm here to serve because of love for God, and I want souls to come closer to God. And she would, through the space of her talk, find a way to bring in the subject of God with a twinkle in her eye. And I would be translating, and of course I had to be truthful to the translation, and so I'd have to talk about God. And she would afterwards say, you see what happened? Everybody accepted it. So although the movement was saying, let's just talk about peace without any religious connotation, but her love was for God. And so she would not listen to us. And time and again, there would be this friction in which we'd say, Daddy, please don't talk about God. And she'd say, you've forgotten? People don't mind if I talk about God. God is my life. So it was interesting that she was absolutely honest with what she believed and felt that this is what she needed to do.
Yeah, it strikes me. I mean, I think that you hit it on the head when you say the honesty, and that's what really is at the root of any commitment to go beyond where other people are. And so thank you for that very sort of playful reflection about Dadi Janki. So I think we're ready for questions now. I think we've got two questions, one each for each of you. I encourage anyone else in the audience to also pose a question in the chat room as well. So the first one that I'm seeing is for Sister Jayanti. It says, Sister Jayanti, what do you feel were the three most important qualities that Dadi Janki embodied?
I think I mentioned them at the beginning, but
Okay.
again, it's come up in our discussion about Dadi's honesty, total honesty. And secondly, the cleanliness, the clarity of motive, and not allowing any selfishness to come in, or personal gain or motive to come in that, which connected then with her simplicity. So all three qualities are connected, but this is what we kept seeing Dadi time and time again, and her simplicity in which people would offer her a gift. I'll give you an example, because Ryland talked about cars, and somebody brought an expensive car and parked it in the courtyard and handed her the keys. And she came outside because she doesn't know about trademarks and names and things like that. So she had no idea, but she came outside the house to see it. And there was this amazing model. And she said to the person who had brought it, these keys are for you. I can't ride in this car. And he was quite shocked. But then he came inside and sat down again with her and said, well, Daddy, what is it that the center needs? And Daddy said, we have a big family, and so get a wagon in which I can have 7, 8 people sit so that they can go for a program comfortably. I don't want anything, but yes, it would be of service to the community if you were to do that. And so her simplicity and absolute nothing for myself. That was Daddy's motto. So yes, those were the three qualities I'll always remember.
That story actually reminds me of, as you know, I was just in Mount Abu back in October, which actually it seems like a million years since then, given all that has happened. But that was the last time that I saw Dadi Janki. And at that meeting, I invited a friend who's from India to come to that meeting. And she, just in terms of talking about deviating from the norm, from the local culture, when we met with Dadi Janki, she went to kiss her feet. And Dadi Janki immediately, she said, no, I don't do that.
That's right.
And so my Indian friend said, well, that really says something about her, because in our culture, this is what you do to your elders.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
she didn't want to have any of that.
No, absolutely.
And that was a mark of a true leader who wants to lead from, in some instances, a courageous decision to depart from the norm, which is not easy in places where there's so much pressure to be like everyone else. Sorry, Ryland, you wanted to say?
Yeah, no, so Eve, I wanted to also maybe talk about cars in relation to Madiba. You know, so the day Madiba was released, I mean, the comrades in the Western Cape, in Cape Town, where I come from, they kind of scuttled around and they found these cars, not the German sedans, but again, in fact, the same kind of make of Japanese car that I saw Dadi leaving in that day, and that was the kind of the cars that took Madiba and around, and he was really also not while he was president. The whole car story wasn't a big thing for him. Of course, there were people who came and offered cars and so on. But I remember when Madiba passed away. So I was in the Eastern Cape because I went to the funeral, and we were staying at the place in Umtata, and there were a lot of people who were working in the presidency, like the medical doctors and people like that. And outside the place where we were staying, there were all these black BMW X5s and Audi Q, this and that, and Mercedes, whatever. And one of the guys, in fact, who was with me, who was helping me because I was doing research for one of the books that I was busy with. But I employed a guy who used to work as a VIP protection officer for Madiba. He worked with Madiba. He spent 12 Christmases with Madiba at Kunu. In fact, he says he got divorced because of that. But he said, his wife said to him, I mean, you never had home at Christmas. And he said, well, the man needs to be protected. And nobody wants to work at Christmas, and I'm volunteering to work. Anyway, but that's a side story. This guy, he looked at the cars and he said to me, you know what? Madiba would never, ever allow these kind of cars, these fancy cars. Everybody were driving the little, Japanese-made cars when he was when he was president. So it is a value thing. I mean, in South Africa, there's the status thing that goes with, the fancier car you drive, the more you can kind of display your wealth. And for me, it's really a false kind of thing that that we need to kind of put an end to. And unfortunately, I think we will never probably get back to that point where cars are not seen as important symbols, and that people will be prepared to use whatever car will get them from point A to point B, irrespective of the name brand that's attached to it.
Right.
Yeah. So there's one other question in the chat room. And I encourage other people to submit their questions because we still have about 10 more minutes before we move into a meditation program to be led by Sister Jayanti. But this question is for Ryland. Which quality of Madiba do you feel is needed most now to navigate through this time in terms of leadership in the country?
I think, in fact, I probably started addressing that question, and I think it's probably humility. What happens with political leadership, and I mean, obviously, I have direct experience of South African political leadership. I can't really talk about what happens in other countries, but I suspect that something similar probably happens in other countries, where you become a minister, and you become a member of parliament, or you become whatever, and immediately you think that you're elevating yourself above the ordinary people. In fact, I mean, I was on Facebook the other day and I saw the Facebook profile of somebody who was a student leader when I was a youth leader, but he's now a minister. And the student or the Facebook profile said Honorable XX, Honorable whatever his name was. And I looked at this and I thought, really? This is Facebook, And so that's kind of part of the problem is that they all want to be honorable, they all want to be excellencies, and they all want to be addressed by these important titles, and then they forget what they're supposed to be doing. And what they're supposed to be doing is to serve the people, which is something that Madiba understood. He understood that this power came from the support that he got from the majority of the people. And in a country like South Africa, the majority of the people are poor people. And so I think that's probably for me the biggest quality that we need. Because I tell you, if our political leadership, they're able to embrace this humility, if they're able to understand the importance of poor people, it will change their mindset also in terms of how they're governing the country and what they prioritize in terms of spending. It's, for me, and I spoke about this earlier, about how in South Africa, it's difficult to forget the past when the past stares you in the face. So the townships that existed under apartheid are still there. And in many cases, they're actually worse than when they were under apartheid. And it's terrible. I mean, and so unemployment is rife. So those things are still there. And the only way we are going to change those kind of things is if the government decides that poor people need to become more important in terms of the equation, in terms of the political discussions, in terms of the economic discussions. Because at the moment, government, they care more about, for instance, if we look at South Africa, they're looking for another 10 billion rand because they want to bail out South African Airways, which is owned by government. 10 billion rand can feed so many people, can build so many houses, can build so many schools. South African Airways is yes, airways are important, but ultimately airways or airlines are used by a minority of the people. They're used by the elite who are able to travel and to fly and stuff like that. So they don't have the same urgency when they talk about, how do we uplift the people of Khayelitsha? How do we uplift the people of Alexandra? How do we uplift the people of Kayamandi or, what have you? So, and that's what I'm saying is that the mindset of our politicians need to change. They need to become more humble. They need to forget about the fancy titles, and they need to kind of realize that the power that they have comes from poor people and the need to give back to poor people.
So I just want to pick up on that, since there are no further questions in the chat room. I think we have a very shy audience, but I just want to, before we go into meditation, I want to pick up on that and pose a question to Sister Jayanti, because the discussion around cars and what you just mentioned, as an outsider to South Africa, although someone who's lived here now for many years, for 8 years between 94 to 2002, and then I've just moved back after being away. This is the most unequal society economically in the world. And I had a personal experience where I was running an office in Johannesburg, and after 5 years, I finally decided to take a vacation. And while I was away, someone in my office stole something like 18,000 Rand and went out and bought a BMW with that money. And it was a young woman who I'd mentored for 5 years. She worked with me for 5 years, and she was smart. She had a good head on her shoulders. And I reflected on the fact that back home in the US, where we have a model of a middle class, I don't think that somebody with the capabilities that she had would have even thought to steal money. And so there's a level of materialism in this country that is very palpable. And I have been in townships where a man who, if he lies flat in his house, his feet are sticking out of his house. And in contrast, I've been in white suburbs where the house will go on forever. Such a contrast, where people have really been conditioned in this country to believe that in order to just live, you have to have a lot. And so the question that I would pose to Sister Jayanti is, how do you retreat from that as a society that has gotten to where it is now in South Africa, where people are so attached to large houses? I don't even understand why they're attached to large houses, since it gets so cold here and there's no insulation. Why would you want to be in such a large room? Sister Jayanti, how do we get away from that? How do we get away from the desire for excess, from a spiritual point of view?
Right. I don't think there is another answer to this question except from a spiritual perspective. And my hope is that people, whether they're rich or poor, whether it is a person with very little or a person with far too much, on both sides, I think it's this mentality that says that my power is with my possessions. My personality depends on all of these things around me. And that happens to the poor and the rich. And that's what the poor makes them to want material things, and the rich to hang on to all of that and want more and more and more. But in fact, it's a total emptiness of spirit that makes us do this. Because if I have that fullness of spirit within, in which I'm experiencing God's love and joy and happiness within myself, then I need very little outside. If you look at the current Pope, Pope Francis, again, he epitomizes this in a way. And so President Mandela's story, Dadi Janki's story, or the current Pope, they understand this, that when there's that fullness within, and they're all from different backgrounds in a sense, but that fullness means that you don't need all those external things to show how valuable you are as a human being. And so the rich man thinks that people will only respect him if he shows his grandeur through all of this. And the poor man wants all of these things to do the same. But no, whether it's superiority or inferiority complex, when you go deep down inside and you see the treasures that you carry within yourself and you connect with the divine, you feel that sense of fullness in which even a poor man can feel very content and be able to give to others a smile, happiness, kind words, encouragement. And the rich man can say, yes, I feel that I have received so much internally. Can I put what I have to better use rather than just for me? Can I use my resources to be able to serve my community? And so this is the change that happens with spiritualities. There's no more this emptiness of spirit. And so materialism and consumerism is actually what has caused us to destroy our planet. The whole ecological crisis is based on this. I want, I need, and I have to have all these external things, which I don't really need at all.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. So we have a few other questions in the chat room, and so I'll read those. This is, what would either of these leaders advise the youth in the midst of the crisis to hold their stability for their futures? Either one of you can take this.
Shall I go first?
Sure.
Young people have vision, young people have energy, young people have enthusiasm. And so these are tremendous assets with which to be able to move forward and create the sort of world that you would like to have. But you have to be the change that you want to see in the world out there. And so I see that young people today sometimes don't recognize that they become victims also, and feel that, you know, the elders have left us with this legacy of a planet that's dilapidated and absolutely broken down now, systems within the government and systems within the economical situation in which there's injustice. But no, we have the power to be able to make our vision become real if we become the change that we'd like to see happen.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you.
You know, I think I agree with the fact that young people need to take things into their own hands. I think I've realized over the last couple of years that quite often we depend on government to do things for us. We depend on corporates to do things for us. And in most cases, their interests are different to our interests. In most cases, they don't, what we see as priorities, they don't think our priorities. And so we need to kind of remind them of what our priorities are. And so young people need to do that. Young people need to kind of put pressure on government. They need to put pressure on corporates. They need to put pressure on civil society to prioritize the things that will make a difference to people from an economic perspective and from other parts of their lives. Because if we sit around and we wait for government to do things and we wait for corporates to do things, we are going to wait forever.
Hey, Ryland, I've got one more question for you before we go into meditation, and that is, if Mandela had been alive, what would he have done with what initiation for world transformation? Sorry. If Mandela had been alive, what could he have done, I suppose, with world transformation? How, I guess the question is, how would he have contributed to world transformation?
Well, it's always difficult to ask questions about what would the person have done if the person had been alive. But I suppose in Mandela's case, he only passed away, what, 6.5 years ago. And his words and his legacy is still very much with us. And if you look at everything that he says and everything that he's done, talks about kind of transforming the world. And in fact, and that's the one thing that we haven't really picked up in terms of this discussion, is that Nelson Mandela's contribution was not only to South Africa, it was to the world. At some point, he was, I think, identified as the world's most popular brand, ahead of something like Coca-Cola. So he had a huge impact on the world, and he was aware of it, and he was aware of the fact that that he could do certain things. So, for instance, when he, he never turned his back on the people who supported him during the struggle. And so he went to go meet with Fidel Castro, even though the American government didn't want him to do that. He went to go meet with Muammar Gaddafi, again, even though other people wouldn't want him to do that. So I think what I was saying earlier about Mandela's values and stuff, he was guided by those values: non-racism, non-sexism, a more equitable society, equal access to the law, to housing, to education, to job opportunities, etc., etc. And those are the kinds of things that he would have still, to this day, be fighting for.
Great, thank you. I think it's now, I just want to take this opportunity to show my appreciation for having had this wonderful opportunity to be in conversation with both of you. I think it's been a very rich conversation. We've certainly learned a lot about both these amazing people. And so thank you so much for sharing. And so now I think, Pratibha, it's time for us to pass on to Sister Jayanti, who I think is going to lead us in some meditation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Eve. Thank you, Ryland, and thank you, Pratibha.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please carry on sitting comfortably, because meditation's something to do with the mind and not the physical body. So focus on that point of light that you see on the screen in front of you, because Raj Yoga meditation is the connection with the source. I've been talking about Dadi reminding us that the source is the divine, the supreme God, by whatever name you wish to call. But this being of light is the source of all positive attributes. And so let's have a meditation in which we focus on this being. Going deep within myself, I come to the awareness of the being that I am, the being of light shining in the center of the forehead. And in this awareness, I can feel the presence of the divine. And from the source of all positive attributes, love, peace, and truth flow into the soul. And as I feel these qualities reach me, it awakens the same within myself. And I rediscover the peace that lies within. The light of God's love awakens the love that had become cold within my own heart. God's love revives this. And as I feel the power of truth reach me from the divine, it dissolves the falsehood and the beliefs that I've had for a long time, and makes me aware of a different reality. And the qualities of God reach not only me, but they extend out into the city and even extend out into the world. And all the people in the world and all forms of life in the world and all that is matter in the world. And as we are touched by these qualities from the divine, as human hearts open up and transform, we are able to move forward and we create a world of love and harmony, of truth and justice, a world of peace. And I see a world filled with truth, justice, equality, harmony, and joy. I keep this vision ahead of me so that I can move towards this using my time, my thoughts, my breath, and my resources to create a world such as this. Om Shanti. Thank you.
So just a big thank you to Sister Jayanti, Ryland, and Eve. Thank you so much for spending this afternoon with us. And I think we all can agree it was a very, very rich conversation. And I think in essence, what I'd like to take through is really that, Dadi's life of just living a life with honesty, cleanliness, and simplicity, and having that courage to live that truth. And of course, Madiba with the humility and keeping to your principles was very beautiful to just be affirmed with that. And in some ways, instead of waiting to be led, I think time is telling us we need to embody these lessons, remember these lessons, and it's time to be the change that we want to see in the world. So thank you very much for your time and being with us, and Om Shanti. And it's lovely that we're in different corners of the planet, but we could be together this afternoon together. So thank you, Om Shanti. Thank you, Eve.